Her name was Araminta Ross, and she was born in Maryland in Dorchester County sometime around 1820. At age 5, she began work as a house servant, and at 7, she began working in the fields. When she was in her early teens, one day, she stumbled onto an angry overseer who was about to attack an older field slave. She blocked the doorway to protect him. Only the overseer in his anger threw a 2-pound weight in the hopes of striking the other slave, but the weight fell short and hit her in the head, which left her comatose for a few days and scarred for life. Around 1844, she married a free black man named John Tubman and changed her name to Harriet. And in 1848, fearing that she was about to be sold to another owner, Harriet Tubman ran away, following the North Star to Philadelphia, where she found work and saved her money. And once she walked through the door of freedom, she was determined to bring others with her. Over the next 10 years, she made 19 trips back to the South, risking life and limb to lead others to freedom, becoming known as the Underground Railroad's chief conductor. She rescued nearly everyone in her family, including her 70-year-old parents. By 1856, her capture would have brought a $40,000 reward in the South. Did you hear that? In 1856, her capture would have brought about a $40,000 reward. On one occasion, as the story goes, she overheard some men reading her wanted poster, which stated that she was illiterate. And so she promptly pulled out a book and pretended to read it, fooling the men who were looking for her. Over time, she became known as Moses and General Tubman. And then in the spring of 1860, on her way to Boston, she made a stop in Troy, New York. And there she ran upon a public raucous surrounding the capture of a runaway slave who had been captured. They had the man, Charles Nolly, in a holding cell at the United States Commissioner's office. She summoned up a crowd that stood at the base of the building and surrounded the building while she blocked the hallway outside of the cell. Over and over again, the large officers asked her to move, and over again she refused. When they finally began bringing the man down the hallway, Harriet Tubman darted down the stairs like a wildcat and pulled both guards down at the same time. In some way, while they were on the ground, she tied her bonnet around Nolly's head, dressing him up in a disguise like a woman, and therefore he escaped through the crowd unnoticed because he was in disguise. Finally, she let the 2 guards up. Imagine that. Story after story after story like this exist in all the ways that Harriet Tubman helped her people escape from bondage. Once she told Frederick Douglass, "In all my journeys, I never lost a single passenger." The Bible has a word for this sort of work. The Bible calls this sort of work redemption. I know redemption is one of those churchy words that everyone uses, but no one really knows what it means. When I hear the word redemption, I can kind of hear the church organ warming up in the background, the choir warming up. I like to say redemption in a preacher voice. It just sounds churchy, redemption. But in the days of the Bible, redemption was not a religious concept, it was a legal concept, in which something that was lost could be restored. To be redeemed meant to exchange one reality for an alternative reality. If someone lost family property, the nearest of kin had a legal precedent to purchase the property and give it back to its original owner. As has already been insinuated, this person was called the kinsman redeemer. If someone, because of a heavy debt, had to sell themselves into slavery, a family member could then in turn purchase them back and purchase their freedom, redeeming them from slavery into freedom. Redemption meant restoration. Redemption meant liberation. Redemption meant offering a new future to someone or something, opening up possibilities which were previously impossible. It meant claiming something as valuable for which no one else cared. It meant being family for someone for whom no one else cared. At its heart, the story of the book of Ruth is a story of redemption. The book opens in Bethlehem amidst a famine. Naomi and her family go to Moab to escape the famine, and there Naomi loses her husband and 2 sons, one of which was married to Ruth. Ruth, who had every right to go home to her father, decided to stick with Naomi like glue and return to Bethlehem. There, with no male in their lives, it meant they had no protection, no provision, in that culture, no identity. One day, Ruth happened to go out picking grain so that they would have something to eat, and she happened into the fields of a man named Boaz. Boaz belonged to the family of Elimelech, Naomi's husband. He was about the closest thing to family they had. When he heard how Ruth had cared for Naomi, he treated her kindly. He invited her to pick in his fields, pick grain in his fields, and not just in the outskirts, but to pick the good stuff as well. He sent her home with enough food to feed the 2 of them for about a week. But you know, there's a difference between a handout and security. There's a difference between living hand to mouth and knowing where your next meal is coming from. There's a difference between going to a soup kitchen and cooking a meal in your own kitchen. There's a difference between homeless shelters and homes. There's a difference between getting a handout and having a good job. We talk about people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, but Naomi and Ruth did not have boots. They were alive, thanks be to God, but they were doing anything but making a living. And so Naomi comes up with a plan, in some ways a scandalous plan. She tells Ruth to take a bath, to get her eyebrows waxed, to get a manicure and pedicure. She tells her to spray on her best perfume, and then she tells her to go down where Boaz was winnowing the grain, and she specifically tells Ruth to wait until Boaz has finished eating and has downed a few drinks. And she says, lie beside him and uncover his feet. Now, in Hebrew, the word for feet is enigmatic and could mean a lot of different things. Throughout Scripture, it does mean a lot of different things. Anyway, it's difficult to discern what exactly happened there. There is at least a hint of scandal here. Anyway, Ruth does exactly as she is instructed. She dresses up. She spies on Boaz, and in the middle of the night uncovers his feet and lies next to him. Sometime in the course of the night, Boaz wakes up and rolls over, awakens from his merriness, only to find that his feet have been uncovered, and there's a woman lying next to him. "Who are you?" he shouts in a whisper. "I'm Ruth, your maiden," she replies. "Now spread your covering over me, because you are my kinsman redeemer." In other words, Ruth is saying, fulfill your customary obligation and marry me. Surprisingly, Boaz is overjoyed at this request. Boaz's journey could have gone 100 different directions, but he seems overjoyed at this request. He says Ruth could have gone off with some of the younger bucks, the good-looking guys, but has shown him the same kindness she showed Naomi. And he agreed to redeem Ruth in marriage, with the one precondition that he check with the one family member closer than he was. And if that man would not redeem them, Boaz would. He sent Ruth away early in the morning when it was still dark so that no one would recognize her. And Boaz promises that he will settle the matter. Now this story makes us squirm in our pews a little, doesn't it? It's a little scandalous, isn't it? Well, we don't often hear these stories at church. We don't often tell these stories at church, and yet there it is in the Bible, feet and all. Thank you. The enigmatic way this story is told just leaves enough to the imagination. We don't know how much of Boaz's legs were uncovered. We don't know exactly what went on the threshing room floor that night. We're left to wonder. And for those whose morality stems from a rule-based system, this story is nothing short of a scandal. And we're also left to fill in some blanks about motivations here. What about Ruth's and Naomi's intentions? Are they pure? Were they trying to force Boaz's hand, knowing that he was the most prominent man in that community? Or did Ruth do all this because she loved Naomi and had Naomi's best interests at heart? We just don't know. But maybe it's appropriate that this redemption story have a little scandal in it, because redemption is always a little scandalous. Redemption is scandalous because it always involves risk. Ruth took a major risk in this story. Do you know what her future would look like if Boaz rejected her? Boaz was the one who had fed them up to this point. If this goes wrong, they're up a creek. Ruth took a major risk. What if someone saw her lying on the threshing floor next to Boaz? She's already a Moabitess. You might remember their reputation. If someone sees her, there's risk in this. In this story, Ruth allows herself to become vulnerable, and she takes this risk. And Boaz does nothing less. Boaz takes a risk too. He marries a Moabite woman. You know, the whispers and the winks as they walk down the street, married to a Moabite woman. And can he really trust Ruth? Does Ruth have his best interests at heart, or is she something like a gold digger in this story? Both Ruth and Boaz are faced with a choice. They can do what is easy, or they can do what love would do, which is rarely the same thing. They can protect their own self-interest or expose themselves for someone else's good. They can guard their reputations, or they can take a radical stand for justice. You know, brothers and sisters, slavery comes at a very high price, but so does redemption. About this story of Ruth and Boaz, Phyllis Tribble, one of my favorite scholars, says, it is salvation by courage alone. It is salvation by courage alone. It takes courage to live redemptively in this world of chains. It takes courage. Maya Angelou once said, courage is the most important of all virtues, because without courage, we can't practice any other virtue with any consistency. Without courage, love shrinks down to sappy sentimentality and convenient moments. Without courage, faith is reduced to what we can see and measure. Without courage, hope will quickly shrivel into good feelings and hollow optimism. Without courage, the follower of Jesus will bypass the cross rather than carry it. From beginning to end, the Scriptures are littered with stories of courageous saints who see the risk and take it anyway. Oftentimes, they're women. I think about the Hebrew midwives in Egypt. Do you remember them? Their names are Shiphrah and Puah. It's funny, in the Exodus story, we don't know Pharaoh's name. Scholars today argue about dating the Exodus because we don't know which Pharaoh the Bible's talking about. We don't know Pharaoh's name. But we know the names of two Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah, who disobeyed Pharaoh's orders and did not put the Hebrew male children to death. And in this act of courage, they undermined the most powerful man in the world and gave oxygen enough for Moses to be born and the Exodus with him. I think about Jesus' genealogy in Matthew 1. Have you ever read Jesus' genealogy in Matthew 1? I bet you haven't. We skip over the genealogies. I skip over the genealogies. Don't skip over the genealogies. In Matthew 1, Matthew recounts the genealogy of Jesus, and he does a very strange thing in the ancient world. He talks about the women in Jesus' genealogy. Do you remember the women in Jesus' genealogy? I think about Tamar. Talk about a story we don't tell in church very often. Tamar, who was slipping through the unrighteous cracks of her righteous society, scandalously called attention to the injustice that had been done to her, posing as a cult prostitute on the side of the road, exposing her father-in-law for the wrong he had done. I think about Rahab. She was in Jesus' genealogy. A prostitute that lived in the walls of Jericho. She housed Israelite spies, although not being an Israelite. Although later, the Israelites accepted her in because she was a model of faith. She was who Israel was to be. Bathsheba, she's in Jesus' genealogy. The wife of King David, Queen Bathsheba. And yet in the Scriptures they don't call her the wife of David. If you read it closely, do you remember what they call Bathsheba? The wife of Uriah. Imagine what it's like to live with a man that's not your husband. There's Mary. Mary's in there. Mary who agreed to the prospect of being a pregnant virgin. Talk about the whispers and the winks when you walk down the street. And then there's Jesus, who had courage enough to identify with the victims and courage enough to forgive the perpetrators, courage enough to trust God who had more future than he could see with his own two eyes. You don't give your life for anything, brothers and sisters, apart from courage. Maybe it really is the greatest of virtues. Perhaps Jesus inherited it from all the women in his genealogy. This is going to sound so sacrilegious. I'm sorry. It's going to sound so sacrilegious, I hesitate to even say it, but it's true. I do not like the Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz has always scared me to death, and I'm trusting you, my friends and my brothers and sisters, with this information. The evil laugh of the Wicked Witch of the East, those flying monkeys. Am I the only one that's had nightmares about the flying monkeys? Whoever dreamed up those flying monkeys deserves a place in the 7th layer of Hollywood purgatory, right between Lindsay Lohan and Charlie Sheen. In my later years, though, I've at least seen the worth of the movie. Some spiritual implications. Peering behind a curtain to discover that reality isn't what you thought reality was all the way through. Following the yellow brick road. Perhaps there's a word in The Wizard of Oz for what it means to be human in the world today. What it means to be church in the world today. The combination of mind and heart and courage. Can I be honest with you and say that I've been in a few scarecrow churches in my life? I bet you have too. Churches with no brains. Churches where critical engagement was unnecessary and unwelcome. Who needs to think? This is about faith, blind faith. This mindset results in churches who warm themselves by the fire of truth but aren't illumined by the light of it. Emotions are important. We all know that. In this place, we gather Sunday after Sunday to talk about life's most important realities. How can we do that with no emotion? Of course there will be emotions. But if we're all heart and no head, we're susceptible to wherever our emotions lead us in the moment. And our emotions begin to run our lives. Rather than notions of faith and truth leading our emotions guide our notions of faith and truth. And we become people who follow Jesus when we feel like it. Furthermore, we become people whose shallow notions of faith flee in the face of life's oftentimes harsh realities. We cultivate a sort of folk religion that we haven't thought through, that we really don't believe if we would think about it. The sort of folk religion I'm pretty sure Jesus wouldn't even recognize. I've been in a few scarecrow churches that needed to exercise their brains. And I've been in a few 10-man churches too. I bet you have. You could hear the squeaking when people walked around in the sanctuary in their suits and dresses. Churches whose brains drove everything they did, but they were missing a heart. Churches that could think a thing to death, but couldn't feel anything if you paid them to. You could be in these churches 6 months and never hear anybody laugh or cry. Worship is super cerebral, but it never penetrates to the depths of who we are. It never reaches our emotions. You know, friends, sometimes we think our way to different sorts of feelings, but sometimes we feel our way to different ways of thinking. The heart influences the mind as much, if not more, than the mind influences the heart. What's that old saying? The heart has reasons that reason knows not of. If every week we are pondering a love beyond our understanding and a grace that transcends our piety and a story beyond all stories, how can we do that coldly with no emotions? Some 10-man churches need to recover their hearts, to feel the truth, not just think it. But friends, no amount of brains and no amount of heart can compensate for a lack of courage. For there is no redemption apart from courage. There is no redemption apart from courage. Because part of what it means for me to claim my redemption is to help you claim yours. To live into that risk like Harriet Tubman. To help others experience the freedom we celebrate. To share the love we claim for ourselves. It takes courage to live redemptively in this world. If you join people in their suffering, some of their suffering will rub off on you. I promise. If you stand for peace in this violent and divided world, that can get you crucified. Crucified from every angle, I promise. To open yourself up, and by that I mean to really open yourself up to other people who don't see it the way you see it. If you do that, you will change. And change hurts. I promise you. To live in community with other people, where you can see my soul for what it really is and I can see your soul for what it really is, and we choose to live in community together anyway, that takes courage. I promise you. All of this is full of risk, and it is salvation by courage alone. Brothers and sisters, there are plenty of safe, carefully calculated pathways in this world. They are usually well populated, they are usually comfortable, they are usually convenient. They are the broad ways. But they are not the ways of Harriet Tubman, and they are not the ways of Ruth, and they're not the ways of Boaz, and they're not the ways of Jesus either, who calls us on the narrow way, the subversive way, the underground railroad of redemption, of sacrifice, of risk. This week I was working on my sermon, trying to figure out what to say to you today, and the phone rang. I hate it when that happens. It was the doctor. Not my doctor, it was the church's doctor. It's a doctor that specializes in ecclesiological issues. And he said, it's time for the church's annual checkup. I said, I'll have her right there. He said, no, I'll come to your place today. And so the doctor came up here, came downtown. I walked the church in, sat her down on the front pew, and the doctor walked in and began to unpack his bag. He said, you can't talk about this, right? You can't disclose information, HIPAA laws and all. I said, I'll be very careful. I'll only share it with the church, so keep this between us. He said, open your mouth, and the church said, ah. He said, everything looks good. He pulled out his small little hammer and hit the church on her knee, and the leg popped up. Reflexes looked good. Listened to the heart and breathing. He drew her blood, took it off to the lab, asked her a few questions, came back with the lab results. I said, what'd you find, Doc? And he smiled and he said, strange thing. He said, in this church's blood, there are remnants of Shiphrah and Puah, and Tamar and Rahab, and Bathsheba and Mary. There are particles of Harriet Tubman and Ruth and Boaz and Rhonda Priest. And he said all their DNA is flowing right through your veins today. He looked the church square in her eyes and he said, all of this is flowing in your veins today. She didn't know what to say and I didn't know what to say, so I said something. I said, Doc, what kind of blood, what type of blood does this church have? And he smiled for a moment and he said, the best kind. I said, what do you mean? And he said, when you put all that together, when you put all those particles together and when you look closely at the levels and the particles and the molecules, when you look at all that together, he said, this church has the blood of redemption. And I said, all right. So where do we go from here, Doc? And he thought for a moment, and he looked the church square in her eyes, and he said, go and be who you are. Go and be who you are. And he packed up his bag and he began to walk off, and he paused, and he said, but don't forget to take courage with you. When you go and be who you are, take courage with you. Always courage. And he walked off. Now I can't be sure, don't hold me to this, but I thought I caught a glimpse when he walked away of holes in his hands. So just to be on the safe side, we probably better listen. Go and be who you are. It flows in your veins. Go and be who you are. And take courage with you. Always courage. Amen.